So the next story that we're going to read is going to involve, it's actually an autobiography. It's an autobiography of a guy who was enslaved in the 1700s. He was enslaved, and then he earned his freedom, and he spent the rest of his life as an abolitionist activist, someone who was fighting against slavery. So I wanted to talk a little bit about slavery, the history of slavery in the United States, or in North America, rather. And then we'll talk about this one particular instance of slavery with a guy named Olaudah Equiano. So we started off talking about John Smith and the Virginians, and then the Puritans and the separatists who came over to Virginia and Massachusetts, or New England, or Plymouth, or Massachusetts Bay, and the first English settlers to settle permanently came over in 1607. By 1619, the Puritans, the first batch of Puritans who left England, the ones who wound up at founding Plymouth Colony in modern-day Massachusetts, they departed and headed over here in 1619 and 1620. And then a few years later, the other group of pilgrims, or rather the other group of Puritans, left to come over for Massachusetts Bay Colony. So 1619 and 1620 was when the first Puritans left to come over to New England. That is also that the first ship arrived in Virginia that brought Africans to Virginia. So the same year that those Puritans landed in Plymouth, you had a ship arriving that contained Africans in Virginia. In those early years, most of the people who were brought over here to the colonies, as they were then, were indentured servants. What's the difference between a slave and an indentured servant? Yeah, I mean, sometimes it would be longer, sometimes it would be shorter, but it was generally considered to be a temporary thing. Somebody's indenture was a contract that would expire upon certain terms being met. Sometimes it was an amount of time. Other times it might have been an amount of work done or an amount of money earned or something. But generally there were terms, and once those terms were met, the indenture would end. A lot of the indentures, but not all of them, were criminals, people who were arrested, charged with crimes, convicted of crimes in England, and instead of being punished by execution or by whatever the other means of punishment would be, they chose to come over to the New World, come over to North America, and work as indentured servants instead. This is a good deal for everybody, theoretically, because they get to not be punished or not sometimes even be executed in England. They get to come over here, work, do very hard work, and probably not necessarily in all cases be treated very well. But then eventually, if all goes well, they'll earn their freedom and they'll have the ability to sort of start a new life for themselves. Daniel, you have a question?
That still happen in this day and age because it's technically not slavery.
In the United States?
Can you start an indentured servant because it's their will?
No, not really. I mean, you could make an argument that there are de facto there's de facto indentured servitude. If you're incarcerated at like Angola in Louisiana, Angola Penitentiary, they call it the farm because there's a big farm and the prisoners work on the farm and yeah, still today, huh? Yeah, I was an inmate. Yeah, how do you think I got so hard? Bad guy. Yeah. So. And they have work programs at prisons all over the country. So somebody might say that that's kind of like indentured servitude. But as far as the old practice of indentured servitude, no, it's at least in that sense, no, I don't think it exists anything quite like that. CJ.
So, the movie Roots?
Yeah.
Were the indentured servants like the ones that worked in the house and stuff?
No. I mean, I haven't seen Roots, but Roots took place, to the best of my recollection, it was mostly in the 19th century, like in the 1800s, and That's slavery. You had different types of slaves. So you had slaves who worked in the field. You had slaves who worked in the house. But they're all slaves. The slaves who work in the house a lot of times were, not to say that they were better educated, because at a certain point in time it actually became illegal to teach slaves to read and write and things like that. Sometimes, and then sometimes you'd have the more the slaves who the owner might consider more presentable or more kind of desirable to have around the house. They'd be working inside, and then the other slaves who were stronger or better for working in the field would be outside. And it's different types of work, but it's all slavery. It's not like one is better than the other. It's all still slavery.
What is better? You get to sleep inside and not be in a hot job.
That's a conversation for slaves to have amongst themselves, not for me. So in 1619, the first Africans, like I said, they were brought to America by Dutch traders, and they weren't specifically brought by the Dutch from Africa to America. The Dutch were on their way anyway. They seized a Spanish ship, and the Spanish ship that they seized had taken slaves from sell them elsewhere. So the Dutch seized that ship along with the cargo on the ship, which included the slaves. They brought the slaves to America, but because the slaves had been baptized by the Spanish, they were not. Because these Africans on board this ship had been baptized by the Spanish, it was actually illegal for these people to become slaves in an English colony or under English law. Under English law, it was illegal to enslave somebody who was a baptized Christian, and these people had been baptized, so they were not slaves. These first people were indentured. So you might ask, what's the difference? But there is a difference, legally speaking at least, between slavery and indenture. Yeah, we're talking about the difference right now. So this is a really interesting story. This guy, John Punch. Some say that John Punch is the first American slave. Even though he was never technically a slave, he was de facto a slave. Do you know what that phrase de facto means? It means, kind of means like might as well have been. He might have legally been called indentured, but in practice, he was basically a slave. And the reason is as follows. So in 1640, this guy John Punch, who was a slave in York County, Virginia, right around here. Yeah, well, this is still York County. So a slave in York County, Virginia, escaped from his employer, his master, or whatever you'd call the person who had his indenture. He escapes with two other guys. Now, he is an African fellow. The other two guys were white. Same way that a lot of other... up to this point, that's actually why this case of John Punch is so important, that historians think it's so important, because up to this point, most of the people who are indentured are white. They're white, Europeans. They're people. Some were indentured because they were criminals. Some were indentured because they wanted to go to America, but they couldn't afford it, so they offered them their service, their indenture, as kind of payment. I'll work for you for 7 years if you put me on board your ship and take me to Virginia. But a lot of the people who were indentured were white. Some of them were black. Some were white. Some were also Native American. This case of John Punch is really interesting and important because 3 guys escaped from their indenture. 2 were white, 1 was black. They were all 3 captured. And when they were captured, the white guys who had escaped with him and been caught with him had their indenture contracts or indentured servitude extended by 4 years. John Punch, the African guy, had his indenture extended permanently. So this, back at this, and they see that this is the first time in American history that servitude was, distinguished by race. So you had the 2 white guys getting 4 extra years, and then the African guy, the black guy who was had done the same thing, extended his servitude for life. So this is this establishes, historians look at this and see that this is the first time it happens, and it establishes a pattern for Africans, African Americans, people of African origin being treated as servants differently than white people as servants. Importantly, historians will note, though, that even though his indentured servitude would last forever, legally he was indentured for the rest of his life, he still was he still was considered to be an indentured servant, not a slave. All right. Another interesting fact about this guy, John Punch. Anybody ever heard this name before?
No.
A couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, this guy's name came up. I mean, he's really well known among historians, but this guy's name came up in popular news a couple of years ago because it turned out that this guy is related to somebody who, to a lot of people actually, but one person in particular who's quite famous today.
Barack Obama.
Yes, Barack Obama. This is Barack Obama's 11th great-grandfather. On his mother's side. Why is that interesting?
Because that means his mom.
What? His mom is not black.
White. What is wrong with you?
Yeah, so
No, his dad was.
so a lot of people had made the remark that one of the things that made Barack Obama originally so interesting as a presidential candidate was that he was he's an African American guy, but because his father was actually from Africa and was not African American, he was just African. That even though he is an African American guy, he doesn't have the same the same history in his family of slavery that a lot of African Americans have today. But it turns out that he actually does, just from the other side, from his mom's side. So that was something that that made the news a couple of years ago. Daniel.
One of my relatives that found out this Friday did an ancestry search thing, and she found out that there had been slaveholders in our family, and that's how there's a black family related to us.
It's pretty common. It's
Same last name as you.
Because they took it from the
it's not an uncommon story. So John Punch is the first person who the legal distinction is made based, it seems, on race. Not long after that, there's a guy named John Casor. And John Casor was also legally at one point an indentured servant. Up to this point, there aren't in North America there's nobody who by English law is considered to be enslaved. This guy is considered to be an indentured servant, and in 1655, his indenture contract had ended with one guy. His indenture contract had ended with one guy and then had been picked up by another guy. And there's some dispute between these two guys over who should have the right to this guy's indenture. Who this guy should be working for. This is also in Virginia. This case is in Northampton County, which is the Eastern Shore, kind of the southern county in the Eastern Shore. And after a disagreement between the two guys who were disputing over who should own this guy's indenture, the court in Northampton County finds that John Casor is legally enslaved. That even though one guy was saying, one of his former, I guess you could say, owners or masters, one guy was saying, oh, well, when the other guy had him, he had him as an indentured servant, and now he's indentured to me. But the first guy said, no. He was not indentured to me. He was enslaved, which doesn't expire. I own him. And he went to the court and presented that argument. The court agreed and said that, in fact, John Casor was not an indenture. He was enslaved. This sets off a chain reaction of a lot of court rulings, legal precedent, and also laws that are being passed by the colonies, Virginia in particular, relating to slavery, when it's legal, how it's legal, the circumstances under which one can buy, sell, purchase, or become enslaved. So in 1670, the courts in Virginia recognized the right of free blacks to own slaves. Oh, it should also be said that that one of the guys up here, who is the owner, or we're trying to say that he should be able to take John Casor as property. One of those guys was black himself. So by 1670, the court is recognizing the right, as they called it, of free blacks to own slaves. Slaves of their own nation, meaning that a black man could own another black man, but not a Christian man. And this was legally interpreted to mean not a white man, even though there were black people who had been baptized and were Christians in those days. Generally, though, it was legally interpreted to mean white. So by the 1670s, it was legal for a black person to own another black person, and from there it evolves to being that any person can own a black person as a slave. Over the next 100 years, up into the 1770s, to the end of the colonial period, something like 500,000 or 600,000 slaves are imported. The mid to late 1600s is when the African slave trade, the triangle trade as it's called. I'll go back to this, but I wanted to show you the picture. The slave trade from the western coast of Africa, South America, into the Caribbean, the West Indies, and into North America, that this really picks up. But by the 1770s, somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 slaves are imported from Africa into North America. And of course, this is also 100 years of not only having people be imported, but also having slaves, have children and families. So even though there are 500,000 or so that are imported, there are even more who are born here into slavery. And slavery from the 1770s goes on for another 100 years or so until it's finally abolished in the mid-1800s. All right. So this brings us to Olaudah Equiano, who is the person who wrote the story, or the excerpt, the text that we're about to read. The story that he wrote a book called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. And you can see a picture of him, a portrait right here. This is not a guy who you would look at and think that he was enslaved. Because he's not in this portrait, but earlier in his life he was. He was an African-born, so he was born in Western Africa. There's some debate or some question over where specifically he was born. There are a couple of ideas, but he was born in Africa. He was captured, according to his story. He was captured and enslaved as a child, and sold into slavery in America, in South Carolina particularly. As he grows up, gets a little older, he is able to purchase his own freedom legally. Once he's free, once his period of slavery is ended, and he's a free black, he becomes a traveler, a merchant, a businessman, an explorer of sorts, and most importantly for us today, an author. The autobiography that he wrote is, I don't know if you would call it the first slave narrative, but it's certainly one of the first slave narratives. Do you know what I mean when I say slave narrative? What's a narrative?
He's talking about being a slave.
Yeah, slave narrative. Somebody who's talking about being a slave. A narrative is a story, and a slave narrative is a story about slavery, written by a slave or a former slave. And so Equiano's is either the first, or if not the first, then among the first slave narratives that is written and becomes popular in the world. He becomes, of course, as you would expect a former slave to become, he becomes an abolitionist, someone who's tirelessly working to end slavery. He fights against slavery for his entire life. And his autobiography is one of the main things that he does to build his cause. In his autobiography, he gives very vivid descriptions of what it was like to be captured in Africa, what it was like to make the journey across the Atlantic, across the Middle Passage, and what it was like to be enslaved. So it gives people who are, and let's be honest, in the late 1700s, who is reading anything at all? Who's reading anything at all in the late 1700s? Yeah, primarily, and not even just white people, but a particular class of white people who have education. Your average farmer is not going to be literate or able to read this thing, even if somebody mailed him a copy of it. It wasn't, literacy wasn't as common back. It was something that only a specific class of people was really privileged enough to have that skill. So the people who are reading his book are generally somewhat wealthy, usually educated to some degree, white people, some of whom might have been slave owners, some might not have been. Some might be in America, some might be in Europe and around the world. but this book gets published and becomes kind of a big deal in the larger world. There are some things about this story that historians question. You know, we talked about this with John Smith. What were some of the things that historians questioned about John Smith's story? Remember John Smith? Yeah, so there are schools of historians, schools of thought who think that John Smith wrote his story to make himself seem like a more impressive figure, or maybe that he was, fudging the details to make his story seem like it was more, like it was more dangerous and more difficult in North America than in Virginia than it actually was, because he didn't want people to think like, oh, it's easy life and I'll go there and get rich and live a life of luxury. He wanted people to know that if they went there that it would be hard work. So they think that maybe he exaggerated some of the stories for that reason. The same thing is true with Olaudah Equiano. Historians look at his story and they are concerned about the veracity, the truth of some of the facts, particularly his origin story. He writes that he's born in Africa. However, historians have found documents that say that he was baptized in South Carolina, which they interpret as meaning that he was probably born in South Carolina. But this brings up an interesting couple of questions. If you are one of the people who thinks that, given the evidence, if you're one of the people who thinks that he was not born in Africa, then you got a couple of questions to ask. Number one, why does he say that he was born in Africa if he wasn't? Number two, how does that affect his story? Does it affect his story if he's born in South Carolina, not Africa, as he says? Hartley?
Back then, when Cinder was, like one of those big, and you're black, would it really matter where you're from because you're still going to be enslaved?
Not really. Doesn't really matter. You're right. So does it matter? Is it an important thing? If not, why would he do it? And then lastly, if he did make this up, if he does write that he's from Africa, even though he knows full well that he's from South Carolina, how does he get the information to write? Because he writes very vividly. Again, he writes vividly about his very early childhood in Africa, being captured, and then he writes very like on the ship from America. He writes very vividly about this. So how does he know this stuff? How does he know what it was like on board that ship? How does he know what Africa looks like? This is where some of the other historians come in. They say, well, baptism records don't necessarily indicate that he was born in South Carolina. He could have been born in Africa and then just baptized in South Carolina. That could have happened. It also could have been that that the records were forged, that the records were mistaken. This is not a period of history when everything is computerized and triple checked and all this stuff. There's the human error factor, but then there's, I think, some of the historians say if he hadn't been born in Africa, then he couldn't have written about Africa and about the slave ship with such vivid detail and such accurate detail as well. So there are historians on both sides, and I think that it's really important to ask yourself, does it really matter? Does it impact the overall importance of this text? You might think it does, you might think it doesn't. That's up to you to decide, and we'll talk about it after we've read it. CJ?
When you're talking about how he describes the ship and stuff, it would make sense that like a person captured in Africa is not to be able to vividly describe a ship.
Well, not the ship itself, but what the ship looks like. But
what he was doing and stuff.
Yeah.
They don't know English or whatever they're speaking here. They don't speak the language. So how would you be able to interpret it?
But he could still tell what it was like for him on, you could still tell a story about what your personal experience is like. Or you could tell a story about what somebody else's experience was like. I've never been to, I've never been to Canada, but I've got family who live there. So if I talk to my family in Canada enough, I could probably write a story about what it's like to live in Vancouver, because my sister-in-law lives in Vancouver, so I could probably at some point, if I wanted to, write a story that takes place in Vancouver just based on her description, even though I've never been there. that could have been what he does too. He might not have been to Africa, but he certainly knew people who were from Africa, and he could have just been kind of taking somebody else's stories and then assimilating that into his own story to make it more powerful on an emotional level and on a visceral level.